morning, ladies and gentlemen. This week we'll talk about the Gothic in the musical theatre, and I hope you have watched the two shows I asked you, so Sweeney Todd and Jekyll and Hyde. Of course, there are more shows that have some elements of the Gothic. We'll talk about them later on, and next week we'll talk about another, probably the principal Gothic piece of musical theatre, namely The Phantom of the Opera, but let's leave it for next week. This time, Sweeney Todd and Jekyll and Hyde. Perhaps it's good to start with the question, what is the Gothic and how it is expressed in musical theatre. So those of you who attended the literature courses probably remember the rise of the Gothic novel around the middle of the 18th century with Walpole's Castle of Otranto, and then the Gothic developing throughout the 19th century, creating many important works of fiction such as Frankenstein or Dracula or Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, the strange story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What these stories have in common is that usually, although not always as you will see, they have an element of fantasy. So there could be ghosts, like in the Castle of Otranto. There could be hauntings, there could be monsters, different kinds of monsters and vampires. And also, if you look at the modern development of the Gothic genres, you'll have zombies, you'll have aliens, you'll have all kinds of supernatural creatures that pose danger and threat to the main characters mostly. But what is really important, perhaps even more important than the fantasy element, is the element of threat, the element of fear, because Gothic from the very beginning was created to express and to some extent to exercise the fears of the reading and watching public. This is the literature that deals with the problem of fear and the danger. And of course, what people can be afraid of is very rarely supernatural. Of course, some people believe in ghosts or aliens or vampires, and they may feel fear against such dangers, but there are enough real dangers in the world, and those fantastical elements in the Gothic mode usually just symbolize very real dangers. So the danger of, well, the threat of death, first of all, the creature of the vampire can be seen as the expression of the fear of death, of the fear of contamination, the fear of illness, contagious disease, the fear of nature overpowering the humans, or humans messing up with nature to their own detriment. Like in Frankenstein, we have the character of a mad scientist who oversteps the boundaries of nature, who believes himself to be like God and create a living thing, which of course turns out to be his enemy. We can talk about fear of madness, which is a very real fear. Also the madness in ourselves, so the moment when we lose control over our own behavior, over our own life, or the madness in some loved ones. This is a real fear, and it was as true and as valid in the 18th and 19th century as it is now. So this is what we have in the Gothic. We have the symbolic way of dealing with very real fears. And if you look at the musical theatre, the shows which take inspiration from the Gothic mode, this is exactly what you have. And the two shows that we are going to discuss today, well, at least in Sweeney Todd, the element of fantasy is non-existent or in fact limited. In Jekyll and Hyde, of course, there is a little bit of fantasy, more of science fiction than supernatural fantasy. So we have another mad scientist or scientist who tries to prevent or to cure madness in society, but succumbs to it himself. So Sweeney Todd is based also on the literary source. This is not first-class literature, this is not high literature as we discussed last week, this is not a novel, although it could be seen as a novel. It's a rather popular genre from the 19th century called the Penny Dreadful, which were cheap novels published as serials, and they were mostly thrilling stories of madness, of crime, sometimes of sex, produced quickly and sold cheaply to the broad reading public that wouldn't necessarily be very sophisticated. So it wasn't the same reading public that would read Dickens's novels or Hugo's Les Miserables. But this was the tabloid version of literature. This was the quick, cheap thrill, and this time, of course, we have the demon barber of Fleet Street, which is even repeated in the full title of the show, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. So a story from 19th century London about cannibalism, about murder, serial killer, about madness, about revenge. Very real threats, although the amount of crime, the amount of madness here is exaggerated. So in this way, it really follows the Gothic excess, the Gothic exuberance that very often is present in the mode. So we continue.